Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies of the University of Kansas for an exploration of how public schools are funded across the nation and particularly in Kansas. This is the last in a four-part series on civic engagement. The previous sessions are available for viewing on the library's YouTube channel. Likewise, this session is being recorded and streamed over Zoom and will also be available on the library's YouTube channel. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Batt.
Hello, thank you so much for joining tonight. We're going to go ahead and start by talking about what the goals of this conversation are. First of all, we're just going to start with a broader overview of what school finance is. We're going to talk about it from the federal to the district levels. And then we're going to discuss how school finance has been measured and evaluated, how researchers, policymakers, and litigators have thought about how we fund schools and how we should be funding schools. And also, we're then going to get into the Kansas specific finance. How is it done in this state, in this district? And then we're going to wrap up with some trends and challenges. So I just want to get a bit of background of how I even came to this topic and why it matters. So I started off as a teacher and a principal in New York City and Massachusetts. And as a principal, I was just given a budget without really any training and had to figure out how to allocate funding, how to figure out where I was going to do with the different resources that I had, which resources I even needed, and realized there needed to be far more education and just thought put into how school leaders are actually doing this. And this experience helped me to recognize that within this system, other than my lack of knowledge about what to do, but there are just built-in inequities, and that was something that I wanted to examine further. And so now here I am at the University of Kansas, looking at fiscal decision-making for districts and schools. So I have a picture of a three-layer cake here. It actually is my favorite analogy for how to think about school funding. And the fact that there are three separate layers of how things happen, but there's some frosting that holds them all together. So they all impact each other. And this is really thinking about there's a federal level, a state level, and a district level. So they each have their own policies, they act their own ways, make some decisions, but they all impact and are interdependent with the other. And I'm going to talk about those three layers this evening. And then there's a word that I have put up there, and that is decentralized. In other countries, you may only find one or two layers to this cake, but in the US, we are somewhat unique in how decentralized we make some of these decisions. Want to come in and join us? Definitely, yeah, I'm sorry. We are recording. Welcome, and I can start over, or? Okay. Sorry, if you just want to come join, thank you. So I was basically talking about how school finance, I think of it as like a layered cake in terms of, we're going to talk about all three levels of where there are three separate levels, but they all kind of fit together. So I'm just going to start with talking about how much money we actually spend on education every year. It is a giant number. There's about $809 billion spent on education. And oftentimes there's a misconception that the federal government is a huge contributor to this. It's actually not the case. They typically spend about 8.5%, or contribute about 8.5% of the funding. Most of it comes from state and local. You can see that the state, on average, contributes about 45% and locally about 44%. And we're going to talk about why the federal government doesn't really contribute much money. So with the role of the federal government in school funding, there's actually no constitutional responsibility at all for education. And they really did not start taking a bigger role in education until there was part of the war on poverty under President Johnson with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which has been reauthorized multiple times, became No Child Left Behind with NCLB, is now ESSA. And so in 1965, in an effort to really push more equity within the school system, support more students of color, they started providing compensatory funding through that way. I'll talk about what that is, where right here I have samples of what the federal government will actually provide in terms of funding. So the primary thing that the federal government will provide is Title I funding, and that is additional money, every district gets it, for students who come from fiscally constrained circumstances. So it's to support students living in poverty. Often this is defined by students that qualify for free or reduced lunch. The IDEIA, oftentimes called IDEA, is federal funding for students with disabilities. Title III is funding for students who are learning English. Often I refer to the students as multilingual learners, recognizing they may be learning more than one. And then unexpected events. And this has been especially true lately when the federal government stepped in to support districts and schools during COVID. And show some examples of that, because I have often heard when I hear community conversations, well, the federal government gave so much money, why don't they just spend that? Or if they're feeling like they're short of money, there's all that federal ESSER money. Why aren't they just using that? And so I want to explain a little bit how there's restrictions on that. Whereas typically federal money, it has to be used for very specific circumstances or purposes. It was not this time. They gave a lot more free rein, but what is very limited about this money is the time frame. And so we can see that there have been 3 different phases of money, and you only have until so long to spend it. And then the money's gone and you can't spend it. So if you need teachers, that is a long-term commitment. You cannot spend that federal money on that. So I'm going to turn to that middle layer of that cake now with interstate or state funding, and look a little bit at how radically different every state is. They have their own policies, they have their own guidelines, they have their own formula for how they fund. And really the biggest sense of disparities that we have in this country is in between the states. And so the average amount of money spent per pupil in this country is $14,000. Here in New York, this is not across all New York schools, it also varies within New York, it's $26,000. All the way down to Idaho, spends about $9,000 per pupil per year. So you can see there's this radical variation. Kansas tends to stay right in the middle with about $13,000 per year. And so my big push here is whenever you want to talk about school funding, you've really got to talk about it at the state level, because they are making the decisions and the policies around what happens at the local level as well. Plus also there's just so much difference. And so you have to know which state you're talking about when you're talking about school funding. And this just shows a bit more of the state disparities. So you can see where the lightest little hexagons there, no, not hexagons, yeah, hexagons, sorry, are more of the lower, tending towards that 9,000 range per pupil funding, whereas the darker blue is more on like that kind of 18,000 and above. So you can see how that plays out across the nation. This is all from fiscal year 21, so COVID funds are in there, which impacts it. So what does the state do for funding schools? The big thing is every year, and this is a big political debate, they have to create and pass a yearly budget, which includes education funding. And while this doesn't happen every year, they set a funding formula, and that will determine the distribution of funds to schools and districts. One of their big roles, and when the state really began to come in, is realizing how districts were very unequal and how they funded their schools, where you could have, thinking about New York with $26,000 per student, that was not typical. You may have some districts that had 15 and some that had 26, so it was just as unequal within it. A lot of litigation has changed that, and states now tend to be more equal across districts. That state level, kind of it's in the middle of that cake, is basically has to act as that middle manager between the districts and the federal government, between all the different policies. And they also provide specific support for particular programs, special education funding, things like that. They also can set policy that really limits the amount of money or can change the amount of money that a district's getting. So for example, most funding formulas are enrollment based. And in 2024, in the fall, we're going to have a whole new policy where you have open enrollment and any student in Kansas can go to any school, which potentially can really kind of change where money goes in between districts. So we're going to move to that final layer now. And what role does the local district play? And they have to set a yearly budget. They have to figure out, okay, we've got all this money, how do we spend it? It's actually not that dramatically different from year to year because they have some costs, mostly labor, that tends to stay the same. And we'll talk about that in a second. They also have to do a lot of future planning and think about who's coming in, how many are leaving, what type of needs the students have. This is why this new enrollment policy may be really interesting, and how much that might change in the ability to project what you are going to be spending from year to year. And they also can initiate referendums and issue bonds in order to gain more money. They can determine which schools have which programs. So some tend to spread students' abilities out and provide services across schools. Some try to put a particular program for a certain disability category in a school, and that'll change things. Or they might have talented and gifted in one particular school. They also, as a district, will pay for certain things like transportation, or they might actually decide how many teachers each school gets, or they might leave that up to the school. Three more things here. So they will decide how they're distributing money. Surprisingly, there are guidelines coming from the federal government about how to spend Title I funding. Districts actually get to make the final decision. So they get to decide which schools get it and which don't, and they have a whole set of policies they usually follow that they develop themselves too. And they can decide how much autonomy principals have. I was a principal in New York City, and the way they have it set up, I had tons of autonomy. I just had a budget. I got to decide how many teachers I had, what I want to spend my money on. That is not true in most districts. It's usually a lot less autonomy, where they are deciding you have this many teachers, you have this many counselors, and then you can spend money for copies. So it can be very different. So where does all this money come from? Taxes. States usually rely on sales tax, income tax, and local funding almost entirely comes from property tax, which is a very debatable thing, especially when it comes to equity. Districts can also get more money through issuing bonds or having a referendum. Those are not as common in Kansas, but they are in other states where they actually have to decide the rate they're going to collect locally. Whoops, I went far ahead. So I finally just showed, we moved to Kansas a year ago, showed my children The Wizard of Oz, and so I have this in my mind, there's no place like home. We just watched it, they got to see it. And so bringing it home to Kansas, we're gonna focus on how Kansas does all of that. That was much more kind of across the board. And so every state has language in its state constitution that basically explains the responsibility they have set out for that state to fund schools. And that language can become really important when it comes up for litigation. And if people feel like that states are not meeting their responsibility, that court cases can happen. So according to Article 6 of the Kansas State Constitution, the legislature shall make suitable provision for finance of the educational interests of the state. So what in the world does that mean? That had to go to the Supreme Court in Kansas multiple times to figure out how to interpret that. And they basically have said that funding must be adequate and equitable. So what does that mean? That's often still debated as well. But in general, at least within the school finance world, how we think of these terms. So equality is just making sure everyone has equal resources. That was really the big push in the 70s. By the 80s, they were saying, well, that's not enough. Think about this picture. It's equal, it still doesn't meet the needs of the students. And so there's much more emphasis starting in the 80s thinking about, well, actually, different students need different things, so we need to fund them differently. And so you started giving resources out according to need. Recently, there's been far more focus on adequacy. And what that means is, how do we think about what we need to give students to get to this? So it's more focused on the outcome. So if we want all of our students to reach this level of achievement, what do we need to give them to do that? And part of the most recent litigation here really focused on that idea. And so there has been decades of school finance litigation in Kansas. And there's at least 41 states that this has happened in. So it's pretty common, but Kansas has been quite drawn out. While the conversation was happening even before 1999, the Montoy versus State case was filed in 1999, and it really started challenging the state funding to the point that by 2006, the legislature had to change the formula of how they distribute money to different districts. And then came all the tax cuts in Kansas, and then the Gannon versus State case was filed, and after 9 years of litigation and testimony and research, they came up with a formula that they consider equitable and adequate. It's still going on, though, in the fact that even a couple days ago, there was a story that came out and a debate within the legislature where the state is still the Supreme Court is still overseeing to make sure that the legislature is funding schools equitably, adequately, and the legislature is saying, we're doing that. You can release your oversight, and it hasn't happened yet. And so Democrats are saying, no, we're not ready to do that, and Republicans are arguing that it is time to release the oversight. So how does Kansas fund our schools? And the state, and this is not true in all states, but the state does actually funding. We use a formula type that's called weighted student funding. Not all states do this. It has become more popular lately. And basically, we provide weighted amounts. So it's really based on student need. There's this idea that the total foundation aid is this amount for our particular year. It's $4,846 for every student. And I'm going to use that loosely because there's attendance that figures into what's a whole student, but I will not get into the weeds on that one. But so if you think about like a student for enrollment gets $4,846 automatically. And then if they meet certain requirements, there's like a bump where they are not just considered like one student, they could be like 1.5 students. That. So they get extra money to support whatever need they have. And then what the state actually gives is that amount minus certain amounts that may be coming locally, grants, special ed funding that has come in, things like that, or if you've had people that are transferring into districts. So what are some of these weights? What have they deemed kind of the categories where we need to give extra support to our students? I won't go through them all, but you can see the slides here. And so you can see really where there's the focus on maybe additional needs and services, such as supporting language acquisition or students with disabilities. One that I want to highlight that was actually a huge debate during the Gannon case is low enrollment. How do we think about schools that have very low enrollment and kind of what's the appropriate bump for them? And it's different, like there's different categories. If you have less than 1,602 students in your district, if you have less than 300, you have less than 100, because you may have less than 100 students, still got to have a principal, still have to have a teacher for every grade or for different subjects, but you may only have 8 people in class. So when everything's done by enrollment and you're only getting enough for like 8 per grade, it becomes very different. And just to see how this works, so the at-risk rate is one of the larger ones. And this is for any student that qualifies for free lunch. So their family lives or their family income is a certain level above the poverty level is how that's determined. And so they get a weight of 0.484. So let's assume there are 500 students in the district that meet this requirement. Then you multiply that by the weight, 242. So really all of a sudden they become 742 students. Give out the money. Okay, so now we're moving to that final layer and we're going to the local funding. And this is the part that a school district is going to raise or be responsible for. And in Kansas, that's called the local option budget. I will be honest, I had never even encountered this term until I moved to Kansas. So this is not necessarily a general term that I've seen throughout school finance. So this is kind of what's considered what the local districts contribute, and it's based on their financial capacity. So what is expected to begin with, that, and this is often called like local effort, what are they willing to put in? And so they must have at least 15% locally that they're going to contribute. That's 15% of that total foundation aid, so that's that base times the weights. And most districts actually choose to go higher than that. They can adopt without any type of unity weigh-in on this, go up to like what the statewide average is, about 31.8. And they can, at a maximum, contribute 33% of that total foundation aid to go above it. Lawrence has chosen to do that without any type of expiration date. So Lawrence automatically always says we will have 33%. But that doesn't actually always come from local property taxes. Keep skipping ahead, sorry. Where does this money come from? Because they don't want to penalize if you have a district that has a lot of property wealth and can really raise a lot of money easily. It's really easy for them to get to that 33%. But if you have another district that would really struggle to get to that 33%, you don't want to penalize just because their property values in their district are really low. And so the state will actually step in. And so if you don't have that property wealth, there's a whole long formula that if anyone is interested, I'm not going to go into now, but I have examples of that. That basically, if that capacity to raise that money easily is very difficult based on your assessed valuation of your district, the state will actually come in and give you so much of the money as well. So what are other ways that a district can raise money? They can levy a tax for capital expenses. So these are things that are not going to get used up in 1 year. So your computer software, buses, buildings, remodelings, things like that. So there can be a separate tax for that. And if you look on your property tax bill, you will see that within the Lawrence, if you're in the USD 497. And they can also issue one for facility, or issue bonds for facility construction. So up to 14% of your assessed valuation is the amount that you can issue bonds and raise money that way. You have to have voter approval for that, though. I can pause here. I've been going through a lot. If there's any questions right now, or there's just okay, we can save it to the end. I just feel like I'm going and going. So, and so what does this look like from the view of the taxpayer? So basically, the property wealth that you have as a district really matters. So the amount that you can raise, as I was talking about earlier, locally is based on your property wealth. So what are the residential, commercial, agricultural properties worth? And there's this assessed value of them, and that actually is done within Douglas County. So they look at, and I've got the equation next, so I'll hold off on that. But they oftentimes express it in how much money you have per pupil. And so you might see if they're talking about with schools, so we have this much property value per pupil, so maybe like $100,000 per pupil. And so that's known as assessed valuation per pupil, or AVPP in Kansas. So you may see that term as well. One particular challenge with this is when we are using property taxes, one way that communities often get in new businesses. So if we think about, I don't know if this actually happened, but there's a huge Panasonic plant that's about to be built down the road, and you have to find ways to attract, and oftentimes tax incentives are given, and so you might lose all of that commercial tax that could go to the schools. And how this is often expressed is a mill rate. And this was kind of, as I talked about that, how to get that assessed valuation. It's whatever your appraisal amount of your property is times 11.5%. And so if you take that for every property and add them all together, that's your assessed value. And so that mill levy rate is based on that. And so the mills comes from is equal to $1 for every $1,000 of assessed property value. Where they get that mill, it's its etymology is, I'm trying to remember, I think. And then the mill levy is calculated basically and determined on how much local revenue is contributed to the local option budget. So if we think about how much money you want to raise, that is how it's determined. So for example, if you have that required revenue, so let's say we've got 33% that we want to raise for our local option budget. So we know that that is how much we need to raise. We're going to divide that by what our taxable property assessment value is, so that AAVP, and then multiply it by 1,000, and that's how we get that mill rate. So you might see on your property tax bill, like how many mills your property is being assessed, and so if you see 20 mills, that means that's like 2 cents per dollar. And so, for example, if your district property value is $100,000 per pupil, and you have a mill rate of 20, then you're going to raise $2,000 per pupil from local sources. Yes, if the more expensive your property is, the more you're going to, everyone's kind of at the same rate. So it's not progressive in the fact that the rate change based on, but you will pay more if your property is worth more. So right now, currently, the mill rate, when there's 4 different mill rates for USD 497, it's at 54.427 altogether. So you're basically, for every $1,000, you're paying like 5 cents of whatever it's assessed at, not what your appraisal. So it's like 11% of what your appraisal amount is. I feel like there's a lot of numbers and weeds in there. So we've raised this money through our property taxes, through all the state funding. So now, what do we do with this money? Like, what do school districts, how do they spend it? So I think it's important to realize that there are 5 different funds, at least around here, that the money goes into. The biggest chunk of your operational funds. This is what a school district will spend from year to year. And then you also have your special revenue funds, and these are for particular programs or services, like special education funds would go in there. You have your capital funds or capital outlay, so these are for any big projects. If you're doing remodeling or buying a bus or something, and that's a separate mill rate. You're going to have debt service, so if you've issued bonds, that's a separate mill rate. So all of these will have been decided separately. And then you have your pass-through funds, and that's for retirement for teachers. And the big thing is you can't move money. So if you have a lot in one or you have a big deficit in another, you can't move them in between. They're for very specific things. And so thinking about how do we spend money, these are just general trends coming from 2021 from the Census Bureau that I kind of talked about what the average per pupil spending rate was. So it's about $14,000. Overall, 82% of all education money is spent on salaries and benefits. And so it is a large chunk that is not easily cut, not easily moved. And 7.5%, and this is included in the 82, is typically across the nation. That's the average for administration of what people spend there. And just overall, I thought this was an important number to add. It's about $20.8 billion spent on debt. And that is issuing those bonds and getting extra money. So how does that compare to, this is straight from the budget for USD 497. So I took this from their most current budget. Their actual amounts in total are not fixed until about a month before the school year ends. So things are in flux, mostly as students move in, out, or needs come up. But in general, we can see kind of what they're contracted and what they're planned for right now. And so the first 4 lines, the instruction, student support services, instructional support services, administration and support, are almost all salaries. That's the majority, it's mostly labor in there. And that's about 65% or so. I mean, it's not all that, but kind of see that there is a large chunk spent on salaries. And so I know there's been quite a bit of conversation around Lawrence about the salaries within the school system. And so this is also from the most recent budget that came out. So we can see that we have, oh, sorry. So there are 59 administrators right now that are contracted, and this is everyone from the superintendent all the way down to the assistant principals. So anyone who's in an administrative role at all. And so there are 59 of them. The average salary is about $112,000. Not sure what the range is on there. They did not provide that. We can see there are 720 teachers with an average salary of $72,000, and other licensed personnel, which are going to be your counselors, your social workers, your speech pathologists. They oftentimes have a different level of, or might have different education. Their salaries tend to be higher, so 76. And then the classified personnel are like your paraprofessionals. They might be people who are driving the bus. Average salaries are 38. There's 600 classified personnel. Might be the executive assistants or secretaries within the office too. So what are some of the challenges that districts face when they are budgeting? That salaries don't stay stable. You can't really choose not to raise them. There's a contract, and with that, oftentimes teachers are hired under a salary schedule. So the more years you have, the more education you get, you automatically get a bump. So when you are planning for your next year, you have to understand kind of where every teacher is, who's going to get the raises, and costs are constantly increasing for your biggest resource. Retirement and health benefits are expensive, and that's become an increasingly big issue within school finance of ensuring that they can provide benefits for all the employees. If the big cuts come, because this is where most of the money is, to human resources, it means less organization. People are wearing more hats. They have less time to do things and do them well. You usually tend to get bigger class sizes, and services are not as easily provided because you have less people to do it. Some services are mandated. There is federal documents called an individual education plan that if you have a identified disability within the school system, they are mandated federally to provide those services. So there's no wiggle room, although there's a lot of creativity I've learned. And so there are things that you can't move and you cannot cut. You oftentimes, I already mentioned, you can't move money between funds, and each school building requires certain staff and services. You have to have a principal for every single building, although some school districts have gotten very creative and share principals, but you should have an administrator always in it. So, got really into the weeds. I'm going to go back to the bigger picture of just thinking about school finance in general. And some of the big challenges and the big questions that have come up for litigators, policymakers, researchers are thinking about equity. The local property tax has often been pushed back against, because when local funding relies on property tax and you have people with more wealth that easily can give that amount of money, and people who intend to pay much higher rates of taxes because of much less property wealth, then that really becomes very inequitable. And the states have stepped in to try and take on some of that effort, but it's still quite inequitable across the nation. And this is a public good, and there's a lot of politics behind it. There's constantly people that are pulling money back, giving more money. A lot of that can go with who the politicians are at the time. A state budget has to be passed every year, and included in that is education funding. Adequacy, there's a lot of questions about how much is enough for academic success. How do we even really figure that out? And what's good enough to be adequate? And that can be a very big value statement. And then also, when we think about fiscal priorities, what's really the best way to use this money? What's going to help our students the most? And how much does that vary by schools? And how do we figure that out? Also, I added this one in there kind of at the end, because this enrollment, I am very fascinated, and my students at KU, as I talk about district business management, are very concerned about kind of the enrollment coming forward and the change in policy and not being able to properly plan based on enrollment, because that's what everything is based on when it comes to money and funding. So how do we do that? How do we figure that out? So some new areas and directions to address funding equity is Right now, there's a lot more focus on what actually happens within a district. Oftentimes, no one was paying attention to that, and they're really starting to pay attention that who actually is getting the money within the district. Because there has been some research that has come out that certain schools that have more affluent students tend to get more of the resources or certain programs. And so they're trying to push back to make sure that doesn't happen. There is actually, I was doing some research with principals, and there's a new policy out there that every school, well, this is done by state, but every school and the amount that they get within their district has to be published in a report, and principals don't even know about this. So part of my, I feel like my advocacy for this is to let people know that information is out there. If you want to know how much is going, even at the school level, it is out there now, and it has to be published since 2019. And also just thinking about how resources matter, how we can best use resources. I specifically, and if anyone has questions about any of these, my research is really at district and school level fiscal decision making. So looking at how school leaders budget and make resource decisions. How do communities understand school finance, especially when districts are in fiscal crisis, and how do they react? What's the arguments that they use to either give more or less money? And one project I'm starting now is how do districts and schools make budget decisions to ensure special education services are provided, especially when a lot of times the funding's not actually there that they need.